Hello. Good morning, everybody. If we could take our seats, we'll get going. It's wonderful to see so many people having navigated the parking challenges at Washington University. So welcome for the second day of our Summer City Seminar. Many of you were at the Missouri History Museum yesterday, where we had a fabulous set of panels that looked at the symposia that have come out of the divided city, and also the kind of archiving and map-making projects that have also been funded. Today we're moving on. We're going to start this morning by looking at the kind of curricular innovation that's come out of the initiative. I think this is particularly important. If we are refunded in this next round, there's quite a heavy curricular component. So we will be building heavily on the foundation that's been provided by these courses. So we're going to start off with, let me just introduce everybody and we'll just do it all at once. The first course is Segregation by Design, and that's going to be presented by Mark Abbott, who's professor of history at Harris-Stowe State University. His project partner is Catalina Frejas, who is not here, so he'll be doing that solo. Then Heather Woofter and Michael Allen will be presenting on a course that they did. They are both in architecture and urban design, and Michael is also in American culture studies. And their project partner is not with us, unfortunately, is Yves Blau, who teaches, the history and theory of urban form and design at Harvard. Next, we have Inequality in the City, and that'll be presented by Caitlin Collins, Patty Hayda, and David Cunningham. That's sociology, urban design and architecture, and again, sociology. And finally, Denise Ward-Brown has taught 3 times a course called Tale of Two Cities. She, unfortunately, because of a family emergency, couldn't be with us, but we've got a little bit of video to share with you from that course. And then we'll bring everybody up and have a discussion. So we'll start with Mark.
Good morning. My name is Mark Abbott, and actually I'm not a professor of history. I'm actually a professor emeritus. I just recently retired, primarily to finish a book that Catalina and I have been working on. It's actually kind of a spin-off of, it was a precursor to the course, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the book is also called Segregation by Design, and it's being published by Springer International, and it should come out sometime in August or early September. But in any case, I think kind of the evolution of the course is kind of interesting. I met Catalina in a meeting at the downtown HUD office, and we were working on a proposal for the Mayor's Conference on City Design. And so I knew she had something in mind because she kind of looked at me and she wanted to know if I ever wanted to work on a project with her. And I said, well, sure, just making small talk. But I gave her my card, and I think she called within 24 hours. But in any case, what she wanted to do was to develop a course that was going to come out of the Divided City Initiative. And she already had a title in mind called Segregation by Design. And she approached me because she felt that it was important not only to talk about the divided city, but also attempt to bridge the academic divides that exist in the metropolitan area. And I was very intrigued by that because I had been kind of doing that already for some time. Even though I just recently retired at Harris-Stowe after 30 years, I've been here at WashU either teaching in the summer program or U College since the mid-90s. And I had just recently started teaching again in the sustainability program, and I had gone rogue a couple of times I paired up a course I had here with a course that I had at Harris Stowe, and I knew it could work. And I knew what kind of dynamic would exist between the students. And so we worked on a proposal in 2015, and fortunately we were funded. And so the idea was to have a course that was going to be co-taught by the two of us. And Catalina is actually in the Sam Fox School of Design and Architecture. I got that all wrong. But in any case, she's an architect, and I'm a historian by training and an urban planner by avocation. And so we decided that we would divide the course into two parts. The first part would be lecture, and the second part would be a service learning component. So for the lecture, what we decided to do was to bring in guest lecturers. And we've had, people from all over the region. Mark Tranel from UMSL, Todd Swanstrom from UMSL. We've had Eric Mumford from here at WashU. So we've had an amazing group of people. And but kind of the heart of the course, though, was the service learning component. And what we decided to do was to create or to divide the students into teams, in that the teams would be made up of half Harris Stowe students and half WashU students. And so the purpose of these plans was to develop mitigation strategies. And so the teams would work with selected communities and develop a plan that would look at causes and consequences of segregation in their particular community. And the students would work with the community to develop mitigation strategies. So we went into the project with the assumption that segregation is a part of every community in America. But we also went into the course with the idea that each community has different needs and objectives in mitigating segregation. So for some communities, the idea is to actually integrate. But for other communities, it's probably more in terms of inclusion. And for a lot of other communities, equity is the real goal. But before we actually started teaching the course, and we didn't start until the fall of 2016, Catalina thought it was necessary for us to kind of steep ourselves more in the issues. And she was able to receive a small grant, internal grant from WashU called Bring Your Own Idea. And through this grant, we hosted 8 different conversations on different topics. And I'm pretty sure that Catalina was planning this all along, but after the first conversation, it was clear that what we had here was something truly amazing, and that we decided to edit the conversations and to annotate them and to accompany each one with an essay by an invited author, but also to tie the chapter to a brief introduction which we wrote. And so these conversations took place in the summer of 15 and the fall of 15. And so we offered the course for the first time in fall of 2016. So again, half the students were from Harris Stowe and half were from WashU. And I wasn't planning on doing this, but I'm sure most of you read an editorial in the Morning Post-Dispatch, and it was rather critical of the institution and particularly of the administration at Harris Stowe. And so the author was a former colleague of mine at Harris Stowe, and unfortunately his contract wasn't renewed, and I'm afraid he's been rather obsessed by the whole process. But the one thing that he did emphasize was the graduation rate at Harris Stowe. And the figure that he gave is actually accurate, that our graduation rate is close to 12%. But having said that, that's primarily a function of just how the feds record the graduation rate. That it looks at first-time, full-time students and whether or not they graduate within 6 years. For most of the people in this room, that would probably sound like a fairly reasonable expectation. But most of the students at Harris Stowe, receive Pell Grants, have full-time jobs, and that for most of our students, graduating within 6 years is an unrealistic expectation. And so probably 2/3 of our graduates probably take 7 or 8 years. And so I guess I'm pointing this out just to illustrate just the difference in the worlds that the two groups of students come from. Most of our students, like I said, are on Pell Grants. Most come from, they're usually first generation college students, and they do have rather poor academic backgrounds. I suspect that the median ACT score here at WashU for incoming freshmen is somewhere in the mid-30s. At Harris Stowe, it's probably 16 or 17. But having said that, I think I like to think we actually perform magic in the classroom, that our students, while they may start at a very low level, come up not nearly as high as WashU graduates, probably for the most part, but we do make significant progress. And so when we started the course, I really didn't have any trepidation about the interaction between the two groups of students. Because I knew that our students, another fact about Harris Stowe students is that they tend to be older and non-traditional. So probably the typical Harris Stowe student is 27, female, and probably a single mom that is working full-time. And so most of the students in the class were older, and most of the students that were coming from WashU, I think all of them were from the School of Architecture. And I wish there was some way that we could pull in students in other disciplines, but so far that's been the case. And but most of the students from Harris Stowe were coming from urban affairs and sociology. And so they actually came from a somewhat stronger position in terms of content and urban knowledge about urban programs and the like. But the other thing about the Harris Stowe students is that they, come from an environment where they live segregation, and so they were much more familiar with the kinds of issues. And so, they could actually point to their own experiences, in terms of class discussions. So in many cases, I felt that the WashU students were differential to the Harris Stowe students, which was what I kind of expected. But at the same time, the Harris Stowe students got a tremendous amount from simply being here and being exposed to some of the skills that the architecture students have. I think many of our students went back and wanted to take courses in GIS, for example. And I think one of the students actually just got admitted into a landscape architecture program at Mississippi State. So, there were all kinds of positive ramifications from the course. But so we've taught the class twice now, and we're planning to do the course again in the fall. But this time, we might have students from the Metro High School here in the city. So I've been approached to do a dual level course at Harris Stowe that would be half Metro students and half Harris Stowe students. And from the very beginning, I've wanted to kind of pull them into segregation by design. And so it's unclear yet what kind of role that they'll have in the class, but I think that's also very exciting. And potential pathway for some of these students into urban careers. That most high school students, they probably have an understanding of what architecture is, but they don't have a clue about urban planning, about social work, about housing careers, and the like. And so I'm really looking forward to this. If Catalina was here, she would want me to say that even though this course was funded because, it was an activity that was curricular in nature, that one of the advantages of the class is that a substantial amount of new research has been done, mostly tied to the book, but also the communities have actually received or gotten the benefit of a real deliverable. That two communities in particular, Tower Grove South and in the first year, and the Shaw neighborhood in the second year, have really used the plan to stimulate conversation inside their communities. And so it's been a real benefit for them. So I guess the other thing I wanted to say was that Catalina and I also received another grant to do a research project called Inclusion and Neighborhood Resiliency. And so we presented some early findings last year at the Urban Affairs Association conference, but we plan to do some additional work this summer. And hopefully next year we'll have a PowerPoint to actually show you. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions at the end of the session.
So we want to thank Jean Allman and Bruce Lindsay and everyone involved in the Divided Cities Initiative. I think for Michael and I, and also Eve, it was an amazing opportunity to get to work with one another and also question some of the issues that we're able to take on in a collaborative fashion. And we're not always afforded that opportunity. So I think this has really been fantastic, not only for the students, but for ourselves. I think there's been a lot of growth. Our project was called Citizen Space, and it was really geared towards a seminar that we taught, Michael Allen, Eve Blau, and myself. And it was about the political underpinnings of cities and how the politics and the dynamics between different community groups really shapes a city in terms of its physical infrastructure, but also in terms of its humanity.
Yeah, so this seminar was allowed us to really combine some deep theoretical readings on race and architecture, urbanism theories like Keller Easterling's extra statecraft, and then drill that down to a lot of granular archival and fieldwork research. So students really got pulled in both directions and went along for the ride to have a pretty heavy and deep reading load, but also this very intense sort of dive into local primary sources. So it's a real nice balance of primary and secondary source analysis, research, and writing. So I think that's something that doesn't happen often in these seminars.
It was also complex because the students were not only going to some of the Missouri archival sites, but also there was a federal government involved. So it was federal, it was Missouri government, and it was also local. And so we made a number of visits to different agencies in the city with greater and less success in terms of access. But it was fantastic to learn about all the different structures within the city that shape a lot of the decisions that are completely invisible to many of us who pay attention to those things, but especially to the citizens and the effects they have on them. Given the brevity of this presentation, we thought we'd show some of our student work, and it took us the first third of the semester to really go into the lectures, do some visits, some interviews, and sort of dive in and ask ourselves, what are the critical questions for this course? And so we made a pretty deep dive, but we know that there's still a lot of work yet to be done. And so we divided the students into 5 groups because it was just so complex that we needed to sort of break it down into chunks. And the group 1 took on the issue of relocation. One thing that we were very interested in, it's very obvious, but I should say it more clearly, the NGA, so the National Geospatial Agency. We were looking at its entry into a new part of St. Louis. It's moving from its site right now into a new site. All of us know that, near Pruitt-Igoe, and it's having a real impact, but it's also a catalyst for a lot of different discussions about how the government intervenes, how the city is part of that conversation, how they're competing to get the NGA to stay within the city, and how the citizens are being treated throughout this entire project, and also how they view this complex relationship and the benefits and the costs, the very severe costs to them, and how this unfolds. And for us, it was really interesting because it's an architectural project that has incredible investment behind it. And it's also opaque. So it presented a research challenge for us in terms of access to information and how we would begin to tell that story. The relocation questions that were critical were ones like, well, where are the NGA citizens now? Like, how were they removed from their property? Where are they living now? So we wanted to document the previous sites. So we have site plans that have been drawn up. We don't have those slides right here, where the students went in and actually documented everything that was there. They also did documentation of photographs. So we feel like we have a flash, like a moment in time, that other historians can build on.
Right, and I think one of the sort of amazing opportunities with this project, when it was initiated, we really didn't have a sense yet of the timeline of this project. We also, when we applied for the grant, the NGA hadn't selected the site yet. So they were looking at first 186 sites, and they narrowed it down to 16, and then 4 finalists. And at the moment when we received the grant, it seemed like the competition was really between this ex-urban site near Scott Air Force Base and North St. Louis. By the time the seminar began, the decision had been made. So we knew this was a doomed, condemned area, and we were actually having the students research something that was unfolding before our eyes, this sort of transition of urban typologies and spatial citizenships unfolding immediately. So, for instance, when we went out to survey the neighborhood and photograph every house with Bob Hansman joining us, this picture we took on that day, the pews of his church, Grace Baptist Church, which would be demolished for this project, were being relocated to the new church building as we were there with the students. So it was very poignant. It really drove home how everything that seemed very cerebral really had this physical sort of biopolitical impact. People were being pushed out before our eyes.
And just as a case in point, as these transitions were happening, the people working to relocate the church that were parked on the street, their cars were towed. So there was this game that was being played also between, the people that were clearing the NGA site that was really local officials and local people, and the treatment and respect that was given to each was sort of alarming for the students and an eye-opener. So one thing that we did was we had a lot of personal stories with the residents. We tried to track down as many as we could with the resources that we had. But it was fantastic for the students to start mapping where those people relocated outside of the city.
Right, and then, I think it's interesting that most people we tracked, we didn't find everybody, left the city altogether.
And then, these are just snippets of some of the stories that are somewhat heart-wrenching in the sense that they lost all their community that gave them support. And lots of times they were put in situations that didn't give them a lot of financial stability and a number of other concerns. So the students tried to document that kind of narrative impact.
Yeah, and so they also did surveys and histories of the neighborhood. This is just a brief sort of account of the deconcentration of the neighborhood. So before NGA, there were these earlier waves of urban renewal dating back to the 1970s when the city used federal funds to demolish vacant housing in the neighborhood, demolishing about 1,000 housing units between 1960 and 1970, and then following that up in the 80s with a warehouse and business park plan that was never finished, a golf course development in the 1990s that was going to put a lake on the Pruitt-Igoe site. So this area had not only a history of the sort of diminution of the dense, walkable urban grid and that form of urban citizenship, but also this embedded history of the city's, state, and federal efforts to erase the urbanism. So the NGA was sort of the terminal point on this narrative.
Yeah, and because there was an erasure happening, it was very difficult to actually get information of a timeline, like when are things going to happen, what's going to happen next. Even the people that lived there had no idea. So one of the things we tried to do in each one of our groupings was to establish a timeline, and as best we could sort of project backwards and also forwards, understanding that we weren't doing a historical analysis because it was happening right in the moment and the information was shifting, as we found it. And then in this particular group, the students also looked at federal policies, Missouri state policies, and St. Louis city and county policies that had a direct impact on how this was able to happen and what it might look like. And so they developed a series of questions, and we had discussions in class. Whose interests did he serve? How are these social political systems enforced differently among different demographics? Not only in St. Louis, but also in the broader country. What do these laws not codify or capture, and what's left out of the conversations? And how do these policies fall short for certain populations? And so they really went federal to state to local.
Right, and so, a daunting, on top of, again, all the readings and histories of the site, all of this legal framework to really understand architecture behind architecture, how law creates space, how law is a productive activity. So the federal relocation policies that were in play, then these two initiatives that the city had sort of laid on the site, the Promise Zones initiative, which was initiated under Obama to sort of foster job creation in the city, and then Strong Cities, Strong Communities, which was in effect at the time. It's now over, but it was the HUD had embedded a specialist in city government to find federal grants for different activities. And it was interesting how both of these activities, these two separate federal sort of dollars, were being targeted to this area with the assumption that it was, fait accompli that NGA was going to locate there, and all this federal money, which could have been distributed anyway to any part of the city, was being used really to make this a much more desirable site for NGA to select and for this project to occur.
So there's this positive aspect of the federal policies that are being developed, but also an undercurrent of manipulation or people who are of the know that can use these advantages to their advantage.
Right, and Strong Cities, Strong Communities, again, was supposed to really be a clearinghouse and an activity that would have engaged the whole city, the whole public, and its activities were largely directed because of, the lack of resources and the sort of, really strong possibility NGA was going to leave the city. The city really put these resources in play to keep NGA in the city and to make this project happen, which abridges the intent of HUD Secretary Sean Donovan and the initial grant the city wrote, where this was supposed to really be felt throughout every corner of the city and every neighborhood that needed this kind of help. Instead, most of it landed right in North St. Louis.
And the reasoning behind that was sound in the sense that they felt as though local communities should be making these decisions, not mandates from federal government. But, there's a consequence.
And the same thing with the Promise Zone, which is still unfolding, which again has targeted this area around NGA with a variety of program goals, with business development and reworking of existing housing. Potentially some of these activities are now, being accused as gentrification measures by residents who are feeling really uncertain. And of course, state law, the Missouri Land Clearance for Redevelopment law, initially created to enable the receipt of 1949 U.S. Housing Act funds, the funds that built Pruitt-Igoe, the Vaughn homes in this area and other housing projects across the city, updated in August of 2016, right, when we were doing this work, with these sort of very interesting definitions we won't get into: blight, community, and sanitary areas. These very, Mark and others in this room know how tendentious these have been defined. And at the local level, countless resolutions to enable this project, not only the resolution like this one calling for NGA to stay and endorsing this proposal, but then a whole nest of bills related to the fact that this area had already been approved through a redevelopment process for Paul McKee's North Side regeneration with this 99-acre site that NGA was looking at in that plan codified as an infill project that would have built around existing residential houses with no displacement. So all that had to be undone through these laws, which went through the Board of Aldermen in 2015, that had to sort of reshape the code, reformulate the outcome so that this could legally then be taken, blighted, and demolished. When this is all happening, and NGA and the Department of Defense haven't made a decision, so the city is going to be the agent that assembles the land with sort of a blind assemblage project. And in the city officials' rhetoric at the time said that if they didn't get NGA, they still were going to assemble the land, evict the residents, demolish the houses and the churches, because they thought this could be prime land for something big, which is again the fulfillment of this long series of proposals for this exact same site that go back to the 1970s.
And the brilliance of bringing the NGA into the picture is that the NGA would not even consider it a site unless the city could promise them that they wouldn't have any clearing to do. Probably should move a little quicker.
Yeah.
And that's the vote that occurred. But the students are learning where to find information on the vote, learning to find different interesting questions through original research. The industry was another area we tackled, looking at the industry in the area. We went and visited all of the neighboring partners. The community used to be one in which industry was surrounded by housing and the people that work there. So it was a self-sustainable kind of neighborhood situation, and it's become a set of industries with perimeter fencing and a much more almost like a battlefield of these different kind of large-scale pockets surrounding this highly contentious site.
Right. So a lot of the typological shift that NGA brings, this sort of super block, has happened on a smaller scale, and so it's building out from this territorialization. Also, we were interested in the narratives of economic growth because the Trojan Iron Works, the Home Improvement Outlet, the Faultless Linen projects, all employing hundreds, if not over 1,000 people, had to be evicted for NGA. And the other projects around there, other employers are threatened by the larger Paul McKee project. So the city's rhetoric is that this sustains job growth, but it actually involves a lot of job displacement.
So the NGA presents this image. Actually, they don't, the city does. And it's an image of an open site, park-like landscape. But in a way, this is kind of a fallacy when you think about their technical requirements of a 500-foot setback, a perimeter fence, lots and lots of parking lots. So the students started asking questions about how do we chart the public and private dimensions of the NGA, what kinds of suppliers and contractors are going to be employed through this process, what's the relationship of the NGA to the university and also to Cortex and other neighbors. And it was fascinating how kind of complex those sets of relationships were. And so they were reading newspaper articles, doing field work, and also looking through public documentation. Right,
and we didn't really, understand what NGA would look like. That drawing was used as part of the brief book to lure it in. The architectural contract still hasn't been let. So
yeah,
it's not design.
There's no design.
That's not it. That's just some daydream. But at Robert Cardillo, the director of NGA, and Mayor Francis Slay were saying that this site would lure millennial employees to NGA and feeder industries, and they'd all want to live adjacent to the site in this new workforce housing scheme of Paul McKee's. So we were trying to figure out the veracity of those claims.
And then we looked at other government facilities that are similarly programmed, like the NSA in Maryland, Fort Meade. We also met with as many NGA officials that would talk to us and people who were on the perimeter. We met with a historian, James Mohan, and talked about the history. The students had a number of interviews and conversations. They then, we're not going to go through all of this, but they then mapped out all of those conversations and different topics and how they related to one another. And when they started putting the conversations side by side, they realized there was no one story. Everybody was giving a different story, and everybody was presenting the information as if it was factual. And so it was just fascinating to start breaking apart these interviews and looking at them side by side. And then that led to us trying to pull together relationships between the different entities and how to sort of establish some transparency in this whole process. And then what always gets forgotten are the people that were living there and said, well, my home is priceless to me. It's more than dollar value. And then there's a whole other narrative about how Paul McKee and others had sort of managed to devalue the property before the residents were asked to leave. And that also was a form of hardship and kind of forcing people out without the government having to go into all and say eminent domain. And the picture that was painted to the public is this going to bring a lot of jobs to St. Louis. This is the kind of community you're going to have.
And even that other image at the top left is supposed to be the Pruitt-Igoe site, which at the same time this is happening was sold to Paul McKee in 2015. He's now the owner of Pruitt-Igoe, in case you were wondering. And that is not even what he released to the public a few weeks later with this sort of low-density medical office complex, which will start with just a single small urgent care box, which we know what those look like. So nothing like that new urbanist fantasy land that was used to sell this to the public.
And he was playing on the lack of resources for the people in that area in terms of health and food and access to public support. We looked again at other institutions around the country, did comparisons. This is one of the first of its kind located in the middle of a city, but do they really regard it as a city, and are they treating it like an urban facility, which has a lot of potential but needs to be designed completely differently? We then looked at Northside Regeneration, the Paul McKee and the plan, and tried to unpack that with some critical questions about the sources of funding, the economic promise. We timelined Paul McKee and which was complicated, and all of his various entities. We looked at the major developments he's worked on. We looked at the lawsuits that have been filed against him and other kind of corporate entities that he started. We looked at the different planning models.
Yeah, the financing to figure out how real this project is, where its sources are coming, where its uses are going. We still don't know the uses side very well. There's actually this week very timely lawsuit in circuit court where McKee and his inflation of prices is coming out through court documents and testimony for one of the buildings that the students actually looked at, the granite countertop place. We also looked at like the sort of socioeconomic perpetuations at play with all this rhetoric about job creation and inclusion. McKee's project itself had eliminated from its redevelopment boundary the widest, most educated and wealthiest part of this planning area, the Old North neighborhood, and then the NGA was situated on the area of the neighborhood that had the highest concentration of African American residents. So the more integrated areas are not disrupted by this planning. So,
we looked at tax abatement areas and TIF districts to understand why certain political zones were being generated. The history of the NGA, which wasn't in the current mapping, site was actually on Tucker. And there's an interesting history about that as well in terms of Paul McKee and ownership. And the last group looked at Cortex, because Cortex had an ideology of being connected to the NGA in terms of people, but also as a model for how you can work with a community in a way that was very different than the model we were seeing with the NGA.
And Mark Wrighton, our chancellor, became a gateway to this because of his letter in support of NGA in North St. Louis expressly said that NGA would bolster the fulfillment of Cortex's vision. So that really drove it home here at Washington University that we should be looking at Cortex as well if those kinds of promises were being made.
We looked at the different players who was involved in all of those decision-making, how they were looking at models across the country, and how the Cortex was being modeled after that. Cortex was in conversation with the NGA, so they had a series of different mission statements and vision statements that we compared. When you look at how many organizations were involved and in conversation with one another, we tried to track that to understand it better. And also looked at their data in terms of inclusion, jobs, investment, because they also were building a case for development around some of these narratives, looking at that side by side. And this is the end.
This is the coda that,
I promise.
Spring or fall of 2016 is when the seminar occurred. This is still an unfolding story. This is a seminar that will probably be offered. We'll probably do this again because there's so much going on. The one thing that happened since the seminar that's interesting is the house got moved, the Taylor family home. The only house that was moved, even though the city promised to move anyone's house who wanted. Right there's our field work with Bob Hansman looking at the houses. We're not so fortunate whose families did get displaced out of the neighborhood. So this sort of spatial rearranging is now to the point where the NGA site is completely cleared of buildings, sidewalks, roadways. So it's still a very teachable urban landscape. We now see this 50-year terminal narrative of erasing and replacing this mode of urbanism at its sort of fulfillment. Even if NGA doesn't get built, this is gone. And this is very unusual to see this. This hasn't happened in St. Louis since the Mill Creek Valley, which is talked about as if it's such a horrible thing, yet it's perpetuated in our own time with the support and sanction of people like Mark Wright and Fred Pistello from SLU, as if it's beneficial. So there is a contradiction and paradox, and where there's contradiction and paradox, there are infinite teachable moments. So we think that this work is not yet finished.
And one of the best outcomes of the class was that we were not only working with students within the Sam Fox School, but in arts and sciences. And just a few highlights. Not all of our students have graduated yet, but a few have. One of our students who received a BA in Art History and Urban Studies is now going to MIT to study planning and political issues. We have another going to UPenn to study these very conditions. And another with a background in economics, which is going into urban planning. So we've been continually in touch with the students, and having that mix of students from arts and sciences and from the design disciplines was amazing in terms of elevating the conversation level and also finding different modes of representation and conversation that we don't typically have in our classes. So thank you.
Okay, so we'll continue. We are the team that is putting together, this is a future class, so this is one distinction maybe from the other courses that we'll hear about today. Our class is slated to be taught in the spring of 2019. So we'll talk a little bit more about the intention of the class and our process of starting to think about the curricular development for the class. I'm Patty Hayda. I'm in urban design at the Sam Fox School, and David and Caitlin are in sociology. Just to kind of highlight the physical space of the campus, this is a class that for the first time is going to bring together students in sociology, which is a new program at WashU. It existed years ago and has come back just a few years ago. And of course, urban design at the Sam Fox School is the second oldest program in the country. So we're bridging the new sociology with architecture and urban design literally across the campus. But one thing, just to kind of frame where we come from in our early conversations, we talked a lot about how a joint class could really bring something new to the table in terms of pedagogy and in terms of offering to WashU students. And we recognized early on that we can learn from each other in terms of things that designers can do. I think that last class was really nice to start to show the kinds of ways that designers can spatialize information and ideate. And we were bridging that with the sort of ethnographic methods and interview and those kinds of methodologies that sociology brings. So we're thinking that this could really be unique where students can work together on urban conditions and bridge the methodologies. So very quickly, I think these slides are, because we haven't taught the class yet, we're just going to frame how we've thought about it. But there are three main parts to our approach to the class. And Caitlin and David will go a little more into detail on some of what we've done. But the first framing, I guess, is likewise to provide students with an overview of the long historical, spatial, interpersonal aspect of urban segregation. So a kind of literature review, looking at the history and theory across the disciplines as one kind of entry. And then the second prong to the course has to do with really drilling down on the disciplinary methods that each of us can bring to bear with the students. And thirdly, this idea that I should say the class is a capstone, conceived of as a capstone. So junior seniors in the undergrads in architecture or in sociology. And we're thinking about, what is the model what is their long-term research project, and how does that touch into the community? And so we were exploring different ways that can happen, and we'll talk more about that. Lastly, there's an idea that there's a longer-term picture to this, that the course will continue to be taught, and that there's a possible ongoing research lab that brings students together after the course, say over the summer, where we can kind of continue to build a body of work and work on this. So did I cover? I think that's as a overview. This is just we made a lot of spreadsheets, and this is another version of some of the readings that we were trying to pull together. That's partly what we spent the summer doing, is learning what our disciplines are reading on the same topics, which was helpful.
And as we've been thinking about this, I'll continue to show spreadsheets. I like it, Patty put this as we can treat this as wallpaper, so please don't feel like you need to, we're intending you to read any of these spreadsheets. But to give you a sense of our early end planning, one of the things that we wanted to do is really get a sense of the landscape around the kinds of partnerships that we were trying to forge. And one way to do that was to think about peer institutions. So I probably have the wrong spreadsheet, which you would notice. So we had two research assistants, really wonderful undergraduates, Jeanette Freiberg and Mariel Ehrlich. Both of them are currently studying abroad in Chile, so they're not here with us today. But they were really, I think it would be fair enough to say, really partners in this endeavor in the earlier stages. And one of the things that they were trying to do is look across peer institutions and say, where is it that we can see like-minded programs that might bring together actually, or at least proximately, the social sciences and design folks. And so we were looking at other campuses, and we really got a sense of the spectrum of the kinds of existing programs that we see. And a couple of things that we learned are that there aren't that many programs that bring together this kind of constellation of interests, even though it informs a lot of programs. You don't see sociologists and urban design people working together explicitly in student-centered programs. So we were interested in what it would mean to move in that direction, and Katie will talk in just a minute about particular individuals who are situated at this intersection who we did bring to campus. But the other thing that focusing on these programs at peer institutions helped us with is getting a sense of, when we look at the spectrum of these programs, there are two broad models, and this isn't going to surprise many people in the room, but it helped our thinking, is that when we think about how these kinds of programs orient to communities, we see approaches that are site-based, that are neighborhood-based, and really trying to work holistically with local people in neighborhoods and think about what their needs are and how the program can connect with that. And then there are organization-based programs, which are really more durable partnerships with a particular organization whose needs and campaigns can change, and the idea being that you can connect from semester to semester, from year to year, through a long-standing partnership with a particular organization. So that informed a lot of our thinking about how we wanted to orient. And as we were thinking more about organizationally centered approaches, one of the things that we wanted to do, especially since, at least from Katie and my standpoint, is we're relatively new to WashU, and what we were trying to do is understand what are the sorts of partnerships here on campus that connect with different community sites, organizations, groupings, neighborhoods. And when Jeanette and Mariel started working on that, largely doing web searches, what we found, and this won't surprise folks who have been involved in a lot of these initiatives, just dozens and dozens of programs, some of which were tied to particular courses like the ones that we're hearing about today, some of which are broader initiatives that aren't necessarily curricularly focused, but we found just a large number of both historical and ongoing partnerships between campus and various communities in and around St. Louis.
These are all WashU.
Yeah, and this would continue farther down. So, ranging from the law school to Gephardt to the Brown School to thinking about Sam Fox. And so we see a lot of these partnerships. We also see a need for mapping these things out systematically. And what we were finding, too, when we were connecting with entities in the neighborhood, in the community, is that groups like St. Louis Artworks are interested in the exact same project, trying to map out what the existing and past partnerships have been as a way to both find gaps, but also to build on infrastructures that have been created in the past. So one of the things that we tried to do through our initial semester of the grant, at least, is to get a sense of this landscape, again, with peer institutions and the kinds of partnerships that are already ongoing locally. So I'll pass it to Katie, who will talk about some of the initiatives that we've done to build on that.
Thank you, David. So, did you want to talk about the SLACO Summit? No. Okay. So we were privileged as a result of this grant to bring a couple of leading scholars to WashU for a few days to help us sort of crystallize our thinking around what a class like this could look like that bridges not only faculty and students, but also WashU and the community and potentially community organizations. And we brought Diane Davis, who is a professor of regional development and urbanism, as well as the chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at Harvard, and she was trained as a sociologist. So she's amazing. She's been on campus a lot. She's from St. Louis, so many of you may know her name already. And we also brought in Javier Ollero from University of Texas at Austin, who's a professor of sociology who studies urban violence and political ethnography, and both of them are pioneers in the field when it comes to doing collaborative research and also cross-disciplinary research. And we're thinking in general about the divided city as talking about not only boundaries, but how we cross boundaries, and these are two people who have done this in really innovative ways. And so we brought them to campus for conversations not only with us and other faculty on campus, but also with students. And so both of them gave talks about their research to help us brainstorm ideas about the course and what we're interested in doing here in St. Louis. We had meetings with students. We went out to, I think we have a slide, right? There are their talks from the front row, me taking photos of them. And then we had some brainstorming sessions with some students over meals and over various conversations where students had a chance to engage with these folks who are leaders in their fields and ask them questions concretely about their research, about the barriers they've faced, and the sorts of opportunities they can envision playing out in St. Louis, since both Javier and Diane are folks who are somewhat familiar with the city, especially Diane. And what else did I want to mention? The next really important series of conversations that we invited Javier and Diane to participate in were thinking very closely to what David just mentioned in terms of partnering with community organizations as one entree into doing actual field work on the ground that recognizes segregation as spatial, as interpersonal, as historical, and bringing to bear not only our expertise as faculty members, but also the training that our students have to help an organization. And so we've been brainstorming about how this might play out and talking a lot about what ethics mean as it relates to community engagement, student learning, and how that can be a reciprocal relationship rather than a one-sided one. And we had a conversation with Blake Strode, who's the new executive director at Arch City Defenders, which is a law firm here in town advocating for the rights of some of the city's most marginalized members. And we were fortunate to also include Bob Hansman, as many of you know, and Kayla Reed, who is an undergraduate student here at WashU, majoring in sociology and African American studies, I believe, right? Yep. And she's on the board of Arch City Defenders and was one of the leading activists around Ferguson, and she's incredible. And our thinking here is that we could partner with Arch City to help them with the sorts of things that they do to advocate, again, for the city's most marginalized. So, for example, they've brought students in from the past from other states to do background research, archival research, interview research, to inform white papers that they've written that have been incredibly influential. And our students, in theory, have the sorts of training. We will help them attain the sort of training they would need to contribute to projects like that. So this was a really productive brainstorming conversation. They're doing work around bailouts right now, and they had a lot of really great ideas about how students could contribute to understanding not only the problem, but solutions to it. And yes, thank you. Patty put this together, as you can tell. So in partnering with something like Arch City for our capstone course, we see again how we can combine these disciplines in really what at least for sociologists, is a really innovative way. So Patty's students can bring to bear this spatial aspect of inequality in St. Louis, and the methodological tools that sociology brings to the table can help not only to tell the stories, the narratives of what's happening here, but also the history of it. And so bringing these disciplines together in our mind can actually contribute in very real ways to organizations like Arch City that are doing very important work and need more support than they currently have. Do you want to talk a little about ACLU?
Sure, yeah. And just as an example of a second potential partnership we've been considering and trying to have exploratory conversations around involves the ACLU here in St. Louis. And this is an interesting place to engage with the ACLU given our locations. Some of you may know that the founder of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin, spent a lot of time in St. Louis, and also what maybe fewer people might know is he taught the very first sociology class here at WashU in 1906. So we have these kind of long-standing connections to the ACLU, at least indirectly through Roger Baldwin. But more substantively, what we're interested in is one of their ongoing projects. There's a long-standing interest via the ACLU in thinking about issues concerning surveillance. And in 2004, they produced a national report called the Surveillance Industrial Complex. And sort of building on that, more recently, starting in 2016, in 29 cities, including St. Louis, there is a program called Community Control Over Police Surveillance, or CCOPS is the acronym. And the idea here is focusing on transparency and participatory decision-making around surveillance, and making sure that people in communities where surveillance is present are both aware of that, but are also part of that decision-making process. And as we know, this is a really complicated field. There are publicly funded and initiated modes of surveillance. There are many private forms of surveillance. A lot of these increasingly are being shared through kind of database centers. And the police use these in various ways, but a lot of other entities use them as well. And so one of the things the ACLU is doing, and where we might see needs for research support, is really trying to map the extent, the use, and the oversight of both these public and private modes of surveillance and their intersection. So again, this is an example of a partnership that could ideally make use of the skills and energy of students, be a sustainable project that actually directly contributes to a campaign that an organization like the ACLU is initiating here, and also connecting to 28 other cities around the country.
Yeah, so this is where we're at. We have our course listing description, and we will admit one challenge to the project is the interdisciplinary listing. It's incredibly opaque who runs that and how that happens. So we're trying to figure out how and where it gets listed such that students from the different schools can easily sign up and attend. So there are these kind of structural, logistical challenges that I guess maybe we can talk to the other course groups that have gone through, and maybe you can give us some names of where to start on this. But we're going to develop the syllabus more concretely next. But I think we are in agreement that our approach will be to align along the kind of thread via an organization that's already working, not on any one site, but it will enable students to maybe deal with multiple sites, but on single threads. And it could be a really, really specific thing that goes deep, or a kind of idea that goes across. The future funding that we've thought about is probably more tied to this lab, and I think once we can run the course and start to see the dynamics, we'll be in a position to be able to think about that too. I mean, we thought about publication, lots of things, but yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so I am going to introduce the next portion because, as Jean mentioned, Professor Denise Ward-Brown had an emergency and can't attend. So just to say a few words about her Divided City project. This course, A Tale of Two Cities Documenting Our Divides, has been taught 3 times now, in the fall of 2015, the fall of 2016, and in spring 2018. It is the first cross-listed class between the Sam Fox College of Art and American Culture Studies program. The educational intention of the course is to provide an experience where students can gain a rich understanding of how art and design intersect with history, our local communities, and social issues. The research focuses on where forms of exclusion and injustice occur in the St. Louis metropolitan region and what and how people or groups are engaged with reform and change. The students' research transforms fact-finding interactions, interviews, and analysis into a work of art, in this case, documentary filmmaking. The class is designed to include guest lectures from WashU, a producer from the Higher Education Channel, local and national film professionals, and community leaders in order to guide students through the history of St. Louis, ethics, and best practices for community engagement, as well as the basics of storytelling and video production. So I've chosen 3 of the student documentary films from Denise's fall 2016 course. The spring 2018 course has just completed, and those videos aren't available quite yet. So the first is a film called Urban Strategies by student Peter Schneider.
The near north side of St. Louis is on a roll. With the Promise Zone, NGA, the Burn Criminal Justice Grant, and today, I'm pleased to announce that the near north side of St. Louis has been awarded a nearly $30 million grant as part of HUD's Choice Neighborhoods implementation.
For way too long in this country, we saw our challenges of housing. We thought they could be met by building buildings. And what we left out of that was people. Who were going to live in those buildings, and services that would be needed by those people, and neighborhoods that could envelop those people, and schools, and jobs. And that's what's so special about St. Louis's application.
So Urban Strategies is a comprehensive community development organization, which basically means that we are, working around developing communities to be thriving, vibrant environments.
So we focus on the non-bricks and mortar aspects of community development, so the people part.
Good community development is often trying to take a really holistic approach and tackling a lot of different things to make a certain area better for the people who are living there.
The philosophy, the core philosophy is that we will do whatever it takes to move a family from point A to point B. That means whatever that the vision is for each individual household.
What's unique about Urban is that we give residents to sit at that table and that we amplify that voice. Like I've been in meetings before where my boss has been like, we all need to take a step back because we can't decide for the residents what's happening. We need to take a step back. We need to go talk to residents first and then come back to the table.
It's not from top down as a lot of organizations or policies can be, so every project starts with a needs assessment. You can't just tell people what they need, you have to listen to them and really be in the community before you can do anything to improve it.
So when we started this process, we asked the question of residents, what is it that you want your neighborhood to look like 5, 10 years from now? Sustainability was a very, very large theme. When they say sustainability, it meant not just environmental sustainability, but also sustainability of programs, sustainability of health, sustainability in terms of public safety. So making certain that 10 years from now, their children will be able to walk to school.
When we were kids, you were able to walk the street when nothing happened to you. By sacrificing in high school, you get your way to the house. Nowadays, you'll be too scared to go to the street. You don't know what's going to happen to you. It's just sad. Like it shouldn't be that way at all.
When we talk about public safety, it's a health issue. It's also a law and justice issue, but it's also non-law enforcement. So engaging youth, engaging police.
I'm working on this called the Borough Criminal Justice Innovation Grant.
And it's all around crime and public safety. It's a community-driven process where we go to residents and we say, what do you want? Like, what are the issues that you identified here?
High crime areas have been identified as typically paying more police, more arrests, how do we get people locked up? And this is much more like, okay, well, let's address the community needs, see where people are at, and just make it a better place to live and make people safer.
We got good people down there. It's not so bad. We got a lot of good people down there. We just want security. We just need some good security.
Many students, when they come in, I ask them what's the best idea they've ever had. And a lot of students say, I've never had a good idea, I don't know, I've never thought.
Slide, example, pitch. Interest starts every here in the makerspace tells every student, sketch a scientist, sketch an engineer, sketch a computer scientist, sketch an entrepreneur, all looks the same. We will ask, raise your hand if your scientist has a lab coat on. How many of the scientists are male? Nearly all of the scientists that people typically draw are male. And then we will ask how many of your scientists are white. Just as many, if not more, raise their hands.
Very early on, students don't see themselves as being a scientist. There's absolutely no reason, in my opinion, that the next Mark Zuckerberg doesn't come from North City. I'll let you know that. And his name, Mark Zuckerberg, I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called the Disruption Department here in St. Louis. The Disruption Department is an organization that was formed because a group of teachers that worked in some of the city schools that they had limited resources. So those teachers were frustrated that their students didn't get to do many of the things that students at other private schools and wealthier kind of schools are able to do. Rather than just complaining about it, they decided to do something about it.
I believe the tool of design thinking is a framework that can help students navigate the inequities they'll experience, that they are experiencing right now, and help them become change agents towards those inequities. I taught history at Seoul in high school, and we did not have very good access to technology, so the master class of 30 laptops. The laptops were in various states of disrepair. Some needed keyboards, monitors, operating systems. So I started a club called Tech Army to repair the laptops so that we could use it in chemistry classes.
A student would take something that 6 months later to fix the laptops. Now, the trick here is that when they fix them, they got to use them.
The students who were part of this club fixed the laptops in 2 weeks.
They wanted those laptops so badly that ended up with 12 perfectly functional laptops just by using YouTube, looking up stuff online. When students are given the opportunity to learn how to overcome a challenge on their own with minimal guidance, we've seen that the results are a lot more effective.
So we have this regular meeting club with all these laptops ready to go. So we started piloting programming, curriculum, robotics, things like that. That led to the idea of what if schools look like this all the time. So then a colleague and I had the makerspace program here for 7th graders only on Fridays. We did it with a $100 budget, and that led to the makerspace that we're doing here today.
From there, now we've evolved an organization that gives students a toolkit of skills to be competitive in the 21st century workforce. So what employers want and what they're saying that missing color and lacking is the ability to collaborate, the ability to think critically, the ability to creatively problem solve, the ability to take a risk and fail and learn from that failure, get feedback from your peers.
It's not really like a classroom. It's more of like a workspace. There aren't too many like set rules for us, which I think is really good because it helps us work and it helps us like make our own space that we're comfortable working in.
What we do is we help schools and organizations build a space where that sort of thing happens.
Welcome to the Crossroads Makerspace. My buddy's dad drove to make a skateboard, and it was grueling, annoying, but it worked.
So my favorite part about the class is the cutting part, because that's the most complicated thing.
We're going to have our processing as well as our media share area to allow.
We were the first ones in St. Louis. Now there's, I would say, maybe 80% of schools are talking about it. Probably 40% of schools have some sort of makerspace, whether it's something small in the library or whether it's a full-blown, specially designed space. Oftentimes, you'll hear it explained as a modern version of industrial arts plus home ec plus art class plus computer class. The word itself isn't particularly important. What we care about is the kind of learning that happens in that space.
Yeah, it's really a shame that Denise couldn't be here. The things that she gets these students, and they have done no film ever, and these are the kind of short documentaries they're putting together. It's amazing.
And you can go to the dividedcity.com and go to the Tale of Two Cities page and see all of her student work from these courses. And there's a bunch more films out there.
Thanks. So let's bring up the curriculum folks and open it up to some questions.
This question I was thinking about was Mark in your course, but I think it's all of the courses that we've learned about this today. And it's about the type of skills that you expect your students, or prerequisites that you expect your students to come into the course with, and then to develop over the course of the seminar or the semester. So and I'm thinking, you mentioned GIS, this program that was a skill that some of your students wanted to go back and after the seminar wanted to learn more about. Because you're working with students from different backgrounds, in cases, different institutions, you're bringing together students with different expertise, and how wasn't always clear to me what sort of prerequisites or what explicit skills you were expecting your students to bring together, and then to sort of cross-pollinate with each other. So we should talk a little bit more.
So most of the students said that this is.
It's on, so it might not work though.
Can you hear me?
You might have to see
So the students from Harris were all juniors and seniors, but except for two students from WashU, they were all graduate students in the master's architecture program. And so they came to the course with different backgrounds, but in terms of the plans, that they had to do a lot of kind of a historical background. And so Catalina and I worked with the students in terms of those kinds of skills. But each of the teams had 2 to 3 mentors. And these mentors, what we tried to do is to have one that came from a planning or an architecture background, and then the second would come from a background in history or social science. And so what we found was that the students more or less kind of divided up themselves in terms of what they were actually good at. So that a lot of the writing was done by the Harris Stowe students, whereas the WashU students would tend to bring stronger technical skills. And so we try to take the students at where they are. And so again, the Harris Stowe students had probably stronger backgrounds in terms of policy and historical analysis because they were my students. Whereas the students in architecture are obviously going to have much stronger design skills. And so kind of combining those two things together was really kind of dynamic.
Hey, Michael, do you want to respond to that question too? Or?
So we enjoyed having a mix of students. They would combine in groups where if you had an arts and science student with an architecture or design or urban design student, it really led to more depth to the kinds of questions they were able to ask. But we didn't have any prerequisites. At one point, we established some guidelines, and some of the students volunteered to kind of outline the way in which visual material would be created and share a template with the whole class. Because the results were really mixed, and they wanted to present a cohesive story in a whole, but they were having difficulty with that. But we had varying levels of graphic skill, varying levels of writing skill, interview skill. But what was great is holistically through the entire class, we had all the skills that we needed, and it never came down to a moment where one student felt as though they didn't belong in that group. So that was nice.
Well, I guess I'd just like to say that one of the things that we really wanted, at least I wanted to give to the Harris Stowe students to feel comfortable with was actually working in teams. I think one of the advantages coming from being in a school of architecture is that you're working in teams almost from day one. And but in the real world, I mean, you work in teams and you have different skills, and you have to learn how to combine those skills. And so the fact that they didn't have the same skill set really didn't bother us.
Other questions?
Oh, I just want to add briefly that the final projects in Citizen Space were all teamwork, so nobody really, all your grades were dependent on your team. There was no individual assignment, so it worked very, very well. It was pretty exciting. Usually in the seminar, the same classes, a final paper, and it's an individual assignment, so we broke out of that.
I think it's really interesting the ways in which the curricular work out of the divided city is making us completely rethink our pedagogy, which is absolutely time. Yeah. Other questions or comments? Yes.
Thank you all for your presentation. My question was mostly to the Citizen Space Force, because as I was listening to your project, incredible, I was thinking of using what you're doing in the future, of the idea of mapping the biopolis. You were talking about biopolitical construction of space through law, through design, through everything. And this idea of the modern biopolis, and if you want to use St. Louis's case as an iteration, but you have so many different approaches of how you construct the biopolitical construction of the city, and how we were talking about yesterday, the idea of mapping it, and how we're from language, not only legal language, but you say in literature, you can go there, or cinema, documentaries, like the material aspects of the city. And I see from what you were the slides you were approaching this idea, how do you map the construction from St. Louis or from any other, not so divided, any city divided city, in terms of bias, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you bring up language, because I think that was part of the sort of pedagogical leap, especially for the architecture students, that, language, we think in language, right? And then we act in language. And these political actors really are actors and agents of language, and that language then shapes architectural space. So architectural space is really a subject of language in a certain way. I think we got at that. The mapping aspect and the spatial aspect, I think one of the things that is clear to us is that this sort of method that we were introducing and exploring is not discrete to NGA. We just happen to have this really interesting opportunity to engage this real world unfolding. But as the semester went on, we realized that there were a lot of actual similarities between the NGA sort of linguistic, legal, and spatial construct and cortex, even though they take different urban forms. And then from there, we 15 weeks, we had to close somewhere, but it's like the institutional players and their own sort of biopolitical spatial activities at Sales University and Washington University are also subjects for this kind of a method. One thing we really, I think, didn't get to, which I think others explored in other seminars, is also these other adjunct sites that are sort of part of this list of space, these military and defense installations in District of Columbia, around the country, that have really sort of become the prototypes for some of this engagement of space, that are really extra urban. So maybe a future iteration can get funding to visit some of those sites, and not just look at how it's happening. So that was one thing I think that was a little not as deep to the students. Where are these prototypes coming from? We're looking at the erasure, but what is the substitution, right? So there's a language and vocabulary to that remains to be explored.
And I think that's a challenge of every design student in a way. We didn't go as in depth in terms of looking at typologies and having the students sort of project into the future what the spatial and material futures might be for those particular sites. But that's where design hits the history, arts and sciences, and that's why it's so difficult to translate. It's almost like they're translators in these environments, but it's an incredibly useful skill, not only for the project, but just for core competency. When they go out in the world and they want to make an impact, they realize it's not just about the design.
I would also just add that one of the other actions that I think was key was the active bearing witness to this change. So while we were not in 15 weeks able to make any definitive, conclusive sort of statement on any of these complicated aspects, the generation of all this material, because this is happening, sort of almost journalistically, we thought was invaluable. It's like documenting every building, trying to find every family and where they went. These are things that are going to mean a lot more down the road as this research unfolds, and the students also having a front row seat to history. And sometimes we're confused, I think, and we think we have to take an ethical stance that involves an action, but we forget that bearing witness is also an ethical act.
Yes, thank you. These are questions. So my question really goes to this sort of conjoining of the notions of urban humanities, and clearly I think the bringing and the mapping of all this documentation, this sort of incredible way of creating archives of the field work has, kind of sort of been an additional or complementary skill, particularly to the humanities-based disciplines. But I'm always interested in the reverse and what happens to argument. In your project or in yours, what happens to, and maybe it's just an idea of like research-led teaching. We have a fantastic dean who used to encourage us to teach around our areas of research. So I'm sort of wondering about the place of the book or and are students coming out with an argument, or are they just gatherers of material? These are sort of, I ask this about my students too, because I think that ability to craft argument, and particularly architecture students, we all know that, to actually write an argument, take a position. Are we capturing that in this? And if so, how?
Well, just off the bat, this is something that designers and I think in the Sandbox School we encounter those tensions a lot because we are training future professionals. So you come up against practice and what's happening in practice and on the ground, and at the same time you're trying to shore up your understanding from a theoretical perspective, develop arguments, contribute new knowledge, new ways of thinking about these things. But that's exactly where that tension lies for us, at least, in terms of applying that or pushing forward with a new way of conceptualizing what's happening. We all know this is where it's very difficult. But I think it's a good point to always remember the other side of academia, that we can contribute and not only, but that's the balance I feel like we really struggle with in the Sandbox School.
Bruce. Yeah, just to build on that, Jean's comment was interesting about changing pedagogy. I think she was referring to the design pedagogy influencing teaching the humanities. I'm curious about the other way around. What opportunities do you see for the partnerships that you all have been working in influencing design pedagogy?
So I can answer that too, but go ahead. Just to start off, because it ties to this thing you were talking about, the language and physical sites. So in a lot of, in my work too, we're looking at sites that have been erased and politics behind sites in St. Louis that are so unevenly developed. And there's a kind of tendency in the design fields to think about generic, like to think about the physical form, like we look at Paul McKee and he wants to put in these warehouses and it's extremely generic, right? And there's also a discourse on site specificity that we talk about a lot, and place and placemaking and these kinds of things. And there's a tendency to read what's happening in the physical landscape as purely, say, generic, right? Like they're wiping out these communities and they're just putting in this kind of externalized, big warehouses. But what is interesting to think about, and maybe this is where it pushes back on design a little bit, is to me they're not generic at all because they're formed in these, in language and in these really specific relationships that are made across the discipline, across like between politicians and business, corporate leaders and the media, and so that's where the specificity lies in relationships. So I feel like I can learn from sociologists and others that know how to understand relationships between people and how power works in a totally different way that's aspatial. So that's where I think design can really learn. Does that make sense?
I was just thinking about one afternoon I took a group of the WashU students to SIU, and we were doing some library research looking at primary source material. We were digging up, well, one of our communities that we worked with was Emerson Park in East St. Louis. And in order to look at some early plans, looking at that portion of East St. Louis, we had to go to SIU. And I just remember how excited they got by looking at these planning documents that they probably wouldn't have been able to find unless I showed them. It was just kind of an interesting experience.
I would just add that looking at primary source material, the research, when you talk about design thinking in architecture, but working with arts and science students lent a complete different dimension to that narrative. And the students' enthusiasm and curiosity grew as they started to understand the methodologies that are used in different disciplines. And it wasn't that they were locked within one methodology, but they were able to reframe their own and have moments of expansion. It was really exciting, learning how to frame an argument better. And I think that there was a cross-disciplinary learning curve that took us about half of the semester before we felt like it was a productive exchange. At first, it was just difference and compensating for difference, and then it became a productive moment. And I think each one of them gained skills of the other, which was really exciting to see. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity.
Rebecca, you have a question?
Yeah, just sort of following up on the language one. I'm wondering, for those of you who taught or the courses in preparation, have you thought about sort of other kinds of humanist methodological sort of course material? Like I was thinking, what happens if you teach Foucault, for example, in thinking about space and configuration, or for the class you're developing, and you thought about teaching sort of classic nonfiction literary text or fiction text like Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, or Teju Cole, or like China Nail's essay on London. So I'm just sort of curious about what literature might offer, or philosophy, or art, like art history. So I'm just curious about what those kinds of humanist methodological approaches might do in courses.
One of the things that we're thinking about doing in the fall is actually the woman who replaced me in Harris Stone. Her specialty is African American history. And she's particularly versed in critical race theory. And I think that's going to be exciting in exposing our students to that perspective. So that's something that I couldn't bring to the table.
Well, this is a great question. I feel like we're obviously in preparation, but even if we were further along, I feel like it's an unfolding process. I mean, our first order working through that really has focused on just getting a sense of the baseline kind of canonical texts across our disciplines here. So not expanding out from that, but just understanding what would be just an absolute given for these topics for urban design students, what Patty would be doing, and kind of vice versa. And so, one of the, spreadsheets aren't always that engaging to work with collaboratively, but we had fun with the Google Doc spreadsheet in the sense of just each of us listing, well, what are the kind of canonical approaches to what you're doing? So that was our first order, but I love the idea of moving beyond that, because one of the things we've talked a lot about are thinking about stories as data, narrative as data. And sociologists do this to some degree, but it's certainly something that branches out well beyond kind of thinking about sociology narrowly conceived. And so when we think about literary text, we think about other ways in which people are engaging with their neighborhoods and also engaging with things. I mentioned surveillance as a possible substantive topic here, the way in which surveillance impacts how people see their communities, how they see their relationships with each other, and who's observed and how. These are things that where knowledge of that is really, it's transdisciplinary in the most important way, in the sense of people's experience with these things are sort of deeply narrated. And I hope that we will think more about other kinds of forms of both media, but also text as we work with this. And I think that first order of business where we've been thinking about spatializing how people experience their neighborhoods, that's one of the major things that I've been learning from Patty, is really going to inform that extension of this. So I hope that we keep engaging seriously with the kinds of issues that you're bringing up here.
And Rebecca, thank you for that question. I can't see you. Where did you start? There you are. So we saw each other last night at Amy Sherrill's talk at the camp, and I love the idea of turning to some of the other source material that you're talking about, and we Hedwig Lee, another senior faculty member in sociology, has suggested that we bring students to these museums, to the amazing exhibits that we see across St. Louis, to try to engage with the paintings, the poetry, the oral histories, theatrical performances that have been happening, that also engage the very same issues that we're interested in studying, right? So Amy Sherrill talked a lot last night about the gaze and what it means for viewers to engage with her paintings. And I think if we're talking about divided cities and crossing boundaries, it's important for us to think about crossing these disciplinary boundaries also in more humanistic ways.
So one of the things that we're trying to think about for the future is not just combining arts and sciences with design, but also bringing in criminal justice, education, business, and just those perspectives. And I think that would really add a lot to the course.
I think that relate all this, but we dug deep on how architectural space is a construct of law, economy, history of race, justice, environment, foreign policy. We did a lot of primary source digging and interviews about experience, but I think something that's sort of in the balance still for a future iteration is the psychology of spatial experience, the sort of disciplinary lens of what it means to inhabit a kind of neighborhood that was replaced versus what it means to inhabit and dwell around the kind of form that's being created. I think that's something that a lot of architectural education hasn't really grappled with on this question. I think we're getting a very strong sort of multidisciplinary lens on urban renewal and urban politics, but the intimacy of psychology is still not really essential to that discourse. And I'd like to explore that further with Heather's permission.
So I want to pose a final question, which I don't know if we have time for you to answer, but I'm going to pose it again when we do our summing up at 4 o'clock. So it seems to me that these courses, and we saw some of this yesterday, we started these grants with the idea there'll be research grants, there'll be curriculum grants, and there'll be community engagement grants, and they all are messed up, and they're all doing all of those things, which is awesome. But it strikes me that we're bridging humanities and design fields. But in so doing, I think we're creating a huge problem that each of these courses kind of grapples with, which is they are creating material, sources, resources, archives that we haven't figured out what to do with them. So, you know, in your course here, awesome, I mean, an amazing opportunity because of what happened, what unfolded right before your eyes. That's not going to happen again, but does that mean you don't teach the course again, or does it switch? And then what about that no other, as far as I know, nobody else has collected the kind of material that you collected for this course, but we didn't imagine that these kind of courses, and I think that that's what they're doing. They're going to end up creating an incredible resource. We're going to have to find space in the library. Your course, Mark, and Catalina's course sort of was in conversation with a book, but it's also creating its own kind of ongoing archive. And then we've got a course in the making that's already imagining sort of a lab as a space where these things continue to be worked on. So I just wanted to get everybody thinking about what I see as a wonderful problem. And I know Andrea's, out of her mapping project, has gotten out students. She sort of started with the archive, and now she's got the students who are going to feed back into that archive. But I'd like us to think, as we move forward, about what these classes are actually producing. And they're not self-contained. They're not the little seminar that happens, and then it happens again the next year, and it happens again the next year, and maybe you switch up books. This is from the humanities perspective. That these are actually generating really important materials, and they're not just teaching materials. So I don't know if any of you want to kind of speak. We have like 4 or 5 minutes, but that's where I'd like us to kind of end this session.
I'm not sure we have the answer, but that's where we struggled, because we felt like we needed another 6 months together to go through the information, sift through it, draw some conclusions, ask more intelligent questions, and then be able to go back again and start to answer those questions. It could be in the form of a book, it could be in the form of an exhibition. You know, we talked about lots of different venues that this might involve. But again, we were surprised, happily surprised by the depth and complexity. And I think it's because we brought a lot of people in from the community to speak with the students, so they had a lot of first-hand information that was able to be documented. But I'm not answering the question because that was where we ended, is asking that specific question.
What do we do with all this?
Right.
Yeah, thank you. Do you guys want to?
Well, I mean, we sort of, and we haven't talked about this as a group, but I think there are kind of 2 tracks. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do is we're working with organizations, say like our city defenders. You know, one of the things that we've discussed with them are very tangible products that are based on information that is directly useful to them. So to put it too formally, something like a white paper, which both presents what we might see as our version of an argument, which is an analysis of the particular issue domain that they're interested in, but also presents and includes a lot of data with that. But it poses the sort of broader question, which is that multiple students are working on components of this and certainly gathering a lot more materials that would end up winnowed down into that kind of report. And you know, I will say, from a matter of infrastructure, through a different project, we've been applying for resources through the ALCS. Which has these digital extension grants, and one of the things about that is that we learn through the university about the ways in which the university is prepared and maybe not prepared in some cases to host these kinds of digital archives, because some of the more emergent social science labs that we've been seeing in our, one of our other spreadsheets, the University of Chicago has a lab that just went up online last year on violence and politics. And one of the principles is thinking about data transparency and the ability of other people to use all the data that they produce. So they're promising a lot in terms of what's going to end up on that website, and none of it's there yet. It's just their first year. But one would hope that WashU will be increasingly positioned in a way to be able to make those promises, but be able to have a digital capacity to create different forms of data archiving over time.